So this morning's question from Jesus for us is, how much bread do you have? How much bread do you have? He asks the disciples first, and then he turns to us and asks us that question. In the reading that I read first from Mark, it showed that Jesus has gotten a big name by this point in his life. He's being followed by crowds and crowds, thousands of people coming to him with questions, longing for him to touch their lives and heal them or help them see things that they've been missing. In today's reading, we hear that Jesus talked and talked and talked until it got dark. I'm not going to do that. But Jesus did. Jesus was a big talker. And finally it got dark, and the disciples were getting tired. And now, not only are they tired, but they're hungry too. And so they go to Jesus and they say, Jesus, this is a very remote location we're in. And those other people, they look really hungry. Maybe they meant themselves. But everybody here looks really hungry, Jesus. We should send them away so they can get something to eat, and so that we can go get something to eat too. Jesus responds to them, you give them something to eat. Well, the disciples are stunned. We're out here in the wilderness. There are people as far as the eye can see. Even if they could find a convenience store open at this hour, they wouldn't have enough money to buy enough food for all these thousands of people. Jesus hears them and says to them, how much bread do you have? So the disciples go through the crowds begging for food from everybody there. And they come back and they say, okay, we've done that, Jesus. We've asked everybody. We came up with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Look, that's it. That's all there is. This is the conversation they're having with Jesus. And Jesus responds to them, all right, offer that. I will supply the rest. So Jesus says grace, and he tells the disciples to go and distribute these measly 5 loaves and 2 fish. And in the end, everyone is fed. And like a good potluck supper, there are even lots of wonderful leftovers, enough to fill lots and lots of baskets. What had seemed like meager pickings became a feast for thousands. What a miracle. Now, some Bible scholars have looked at this passage and suggested that maybe those huge crowds that were following Jesus actually had more food with them, tucked away somewhere in their pockets. But out of fear that maybe they wouldn't have enough on this journey they'd been on following Jesus, they didn't want to tell anybody else about this extra food they were carrying in their pockets. But when they saw Jesus begin to offer just a few meager scraps of food, they were moved to become more generous themselves. And they reached into their pockets and pouches and shared what they had with everyone. And in so doing, they found they had enough. It was more than enough. So maybe, as is more traditionally understood, maybe Jesus did perform a miracle. Praise God. Or maybe the miracle was that Jesus taught the people enough about God that they became aware of the abundance they had. They were able to trust that God would provide. They didn't have to store up bread for the future. God would provide, and so they were able to trust in God's abundance and to be part of this miracle. Who knows? But clearly, it was a miracle. Even so, it was tough. If you continue to read through the Gospel of Mark, you can see that even after that story, the disciples just were really struggling with this whole idea of abundance. And so Jesus patiently continues to try to get it across to them. He goes on in Mark 8 to perform almost exactly the same miracle again, feeding huge crowds of people with very little food. He pulls the disciples aside on their boat and talks to them some more, trying to explain, God will provide. God will give you more than enough. He wants his disciples to hear this message, to trust that God will look out for them, that God is generous. God always provides enough, more than enough, to meet our needs. And that when they can begin to trust in that God, they will have this theology of abundance, living their lives confident that they will have enough. But instead of a theology of abundance, the disciples instead are more inclined toward a theology of scarcity. Over and over again, we see that they're not sure that they're going to have enough, and they get worried. They can't bring themselves to trust that God will provide them with enough. They have this theology of scarcity, and that's a tough theology to shake. So perhaps you're feeling a little nervous when you see Jesus turn his eyes to you and ask you that same question. How much bread do you have? Well, if we're honest, oftentimes we really don't want Jesus to ask this question because we're afraid. We're afraid we won't have enough. We hear this question and we look around and all we see is scarcity. How can I help other people when I'm not even sure I have enough? Maybe I've got a big bill coming in the mail next week. Maybe I'll need to replace my car soon or get it fixed. Will I have enough to send my kids to college? What if I get hit with a really big medical bill? Am I ever going to be able to retire? And if I do, is there some way that I'll have enough so that I can avoid being a burden to my kids? This question stirs up all kinds of reactions. A lot of them are underlying panic and fear. Maybe there won't be enough. I think that the way we were raised sometimes affects whether we react to Jesus' question with a theology of abundance or a theology of scarcity. I don't like to blame parents for things. It seems like a real cop-out. Plus, I'm a parent now. It's not easy being a parent. So I don't want to blame parents. But when I look back on my life, I know why I often operate out of a theology of scarcity. It's because I grew up pinching pennies. I have a very, very clear memory from way back. I must have been maybe 6 years old, I'm not sure. But my dad and I were walking past Andy's convenience store, not too far from our house. And I reached into my pocket and I said, "Dad, look, I've got a nickel. Can I go into Andy's and buy a candy bar?" And Dad looked at me and my nickel and he said, "Put the nickel back in your pocket. Save it for college." That is so my dad. And the really sad thing is that I listened and I put that nickel back in my pocket and I saved it for college, and I think it bought me about 5 minutes. Kind of wish I'd had the chocolate. But you see, my parents had 4 kids, and they were penny pinchers, as were their parents before them. And I have a newspaper article to prove it. You see, my dad used to love writing articles for the local newspaper, to the Anchorage Daily News. And apparently the newspaper enjoyed printing them, because I was forever going to school and my teachers would say, "Oh, I read your dad's article." And I'd say, "What?" But this article I really like. I think mainly because it shows what an angel I've always been. My dad wrote in this article, "A few years ago, one night at 11 p.m., I discovered that every light in the house is on. Bethinking myself of my modest salary and the claim the orthodontist presently has on much of it, I go on a sudden economy kick, rushing from room to turn off lights and, incidentally, to turn the thermostat down as far as it will go. Daughter number two, bless her, is reading quietly in bed with just 100 watts on and 100 pages to go in one of the last of 15 books she's checked out of this Bernard Branch library. I arrive at my last port of call, the downstairs playroom. Here, in one of my sober moments, I once calculated that every light added up to an extravagant 1,920 watts. Now I find number one son engaged in racing cars in the playroom. Of course, all those lights are on. And he goes on. So you can see, I hope, that it's a real miracle that with having a dad like mine, I now tithe on my income. I give away 10% of what I earn. This is not the way I was raised. And I can tell you that making that step did not come easily to me. It did not come easily at all, and I was much older before I was able to pull it off. And so I get it. Perhaps there are things in the ways you were raised that impacts how you respond to Jesus when he asks you, how much bread do you have? Believe me, I know how hard it is to hear that question. And I want to make it easier somehow for you. So today, as you leave this place, I've asked our ushers to hand out something to you just to look at. I don't want it back. I don't want you to fill it out. You can do whatever you want with it. But it's just one sheet that looks like this. It's just one side. David Abbott from the United Methodist Foundation of New England shared this with our strategy team last year. And we had a good conversation about it. But it asks 5 more questions to reflect on, just on your own life. And perhaps it will help you understand the reaction you have when Jesus turns to you and says, how much bread do you have? Jesus asks, how much bread do you have? Now, I want to be clear. If you look at your bank account and discover that there's really not much money there, that you really don't have much bread, let me assure you, it is not God's intention to make you starve to death. As our choir anthem said, the Lord never closes his eyes. God is always watching over us, always providing an abundance to us if we can but see it. And God gave us brains and expects us to use that abundance to find our way, to make sure we do have enough bread. Jesus said, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. Our church also offers a variety of other resources. One that's coming up is a class called Financial Peace University, being taught by Paul Cloutier later in February. This can help all of us take a good look at our bank accounts and make sure that we can see that God will provide for us. God does provide us with an abundance. It's a class that can help us to get out of debt and move into a life of generosity, a theology of abundance. Jesus asks us, how much bread do you have? When we feel secure, when we can get our way into this theology of abundance, when we're confident that God does provide for us, then this question isn't scary at all, because we know when we look around that we do have an abundant life. I know that tonight I will have a roof over my head, a place to sleep. I know that there will be food on the table the next time I get hungry. These are very basic things, but what a blessing they are. What an abundance it is to know that God provides. God provides us with so much, and when we stop and hear this question, take a moment to think about it, we see the abundance that we have in our lives. So today, Jesus reaches out to us, trying to initiate a conversation with us. He begins with this opening question, how much bread do you have? And then he waits expectantly for our response, hoping that we will look around and see God's abundance and then respond to Jesus saying, wow, look how much I have. Woohoo! I have enough. I have more than enough. I have an abundance. Thank you, God.